The village of Lindworm sat quietly nestled in the Draconi mountain range. Most of the buildings stood empty as a silent breeze rustled the tree-lined streets. The villagers slowly moved down the main street, their feet heavy from recent events. The structures bore silent witness to the solemn procession marching past them. With the Mage War over, many residents had returned, though not quite as many as who had not. Those who'd remained home thanked the stars and mourned for those who had passed on. Those who had participated in the fight stumbled on weary feet, and those unable to join them lay in hospital beds from injuries sustained in battle. Banners hung from makeshift poles, each embroidered with the names from the fallen of each sect. Family and friends held those banners high as they marched towards the green quad. A large bonfire burned in the middle of the grassy field, waiting for the masses. One by one, the villagers threw the banners into the fire. Names were called out as the fabric burned. The mourners huddled in small groups as the flames rose higher with each addition. The smoke spiraled out over the mountain peaks above the village, further darkening the overcast sky. As the last banner turned to ash, rain began to fall at a gentle pace that soon picked up in tempo. The sky's water mingled with the tears of the mourners as they turned their faces to the heavens. The battle at the mountain would not be forgotten anytime soon. Courtney Willis surveyed the remains of their campsite with a sense of finality. They had already taken down the tents and had stowed them in their respective bags. The stones from the fire pit were scattered, along with the ashes. A few impressions and a pile of gear remained. They bore witness to what had once housed a small handful of desperate defenders. With a sigh, the blonde tucked a stray strand of hair back into place. Walter had already carted his stuff down to the raft. She had just needed to carry down the rest of the equipment, but she still hesitated. This place held so many memories, tinged with hints of regret and sadness. She still couldn't believe that Margot Pack was gone. An eagle soared overhead, its wings spread as it caught an updraft. Courtney followed its progress until it dropped out of sight over the crest of the island. It wasn't an area she'd had much time to explore, nor might she ever. That place was sacred to the dragons. Those of mortal blood were not allowed there, with perhaps one exception, she amended in her thoughts. The crunch of footsteps on the rough ground alerted her to the return of her companion. She turned to watch him come up through the trees. The forested island had been home for a short while, but now it was time to return to the village. They were both needed there.
Still waiting, huh?
Walter asked as he entered the clearing. He glanced towards the rise of land where Anwen and Tyler had disappeared hours ago. His dark skin stood out in contrast to Courtney's more pale tones. His hair looked in need of a trim, no longer quite regulation length. Even though he was no longer a part of the reserve, he kept up appearances. Courtney nodded.
It's still unreal,
she confessed.
It feels like it was only yesterday. I was sparring with Margot.
She paused to swallow a lump in her throat.
And now she's gone.
The woman had taught her so much about magecraft. She taught her even more about camaraderie and friendship, almost as much as Anwen had. Walter nodded as he rubbed the stubble on his chin. He was in desperate need of a shave, but hadn't taken the time. There were more important things to worry about.
I know,
he said as he placed a hand on her shoulder.
Yep. I'm gonna miss her too.
Margot had a personality unlike any other woman he'd met. Her fiery spirit was hard to forget, down to her almost stubborn way of doing things. And even though she was Walter's senior in age, he couldn't help but think of her as a feisty kid sister. It didn't help that he'd been that much taller than her either. Picking up the 2 tent bundles, Walter turned to go.
Come on,
he invited.
They'll come when they're ready.
He nodded towards the top of the hill above them.
The others are waiting for us.
Courtney grabbed the last bag and followed the veteran back down towards Lake Wyvern. Overhead, the sun filtered down through the trees. The sky radiated a clear blue color, with the occasional cloud on display. The light made the trees seem that much more alive. The sapphire blue water of Lake Wyvern lapped at the sides of the rubber military raft tied to the small jetty. It wasn't the same jetty they'd used that first time to cross over to the island. This one jutted out from where the tail of the island would have thrust out. From above, the island resembled the body of a partially submerged dragon, and at the top sat the sacred grove with its emerald-leaved trees. Walter threw the last of the luggage into the raft and tied it down.
Yeah, I think we're ready,
he called out as he caught Courtney looking back. The water started to bubble at his words, and 2 water dragons swam to the surface. Their scales shone in a darker variation of the lake's color. Their serpentine bodies writhed in the water, sleek and wingless. Their eyes shone wiser than mortal thought. It seemed as though they dared any mortal to stare into them long enough to drown in the waters of their home.
You cold?
One Imugi dragon asked as it lifted its head from the water. Its voice seemed to hiss as if using too much air.
Are you ready to return to the mainland?
Courtney nodded to their guides as she turned to stare. It was still strange to see real flesh and blood dragons. Outside of Tyler, that was. Even that had taken some getting used to. The two mortals stepped into the boat and took their positions. While they did this, the other dragons wound the rope around its body. Water sloshed up onto the sand as the serpent spun to secure the line. With a nudge from the first sea snake, the boat began to move, pulling away from the shore. A cool draft of air filtered across the water as Courtney looked back. She fancied she saw a glint of silver from the crown of the island before she lost sight of it due to their speed of travel. Anwen Porter let her long hair flow freely in the breeze. Almost a week had passed since the great battle, and her heart still felt numb. Her light purple dress swept around with the wind as she stared at it. The breeze teased her auburn hair, flinging it into her face one moment, out behind her the next. Her hazel green eyes gazed at the trees of the sacred grove. As was custom from the time before they'd sealed the mountain, she raised the bone knife Tyler had lent her. With great ceremony, she slipped the blade between the branch and the trunk of one of the majestic trees. The small branch fell into her other hand, the smooth white bark almost warm against her skin. She could feel the wood vibrating with energy before it went still. With equal ceremony, Tyler Durand took back the white knife and put it in his pocket.
Let that which was taken be returned to the mountain,
he intoned as Anwen presented the branch to him. He held the limb aloft so the sun's rays ran the length of it. Anwen felt a tear run down her face as she accepted the smooth wood back once more.
Rest in peace, Mom.
She whispered. When they returned, the branch would be woven into the lattice-covered tombs outside of the ruined city. She was glad she would not be the one doing the weaving. The solemn assembly had been held inside the main hall of Tarragon for all who had died during the battle, separate from the one held in the village. A more intimate gathering had collected to mourn the passing of Anwen's mother, but with no body, the actual burial hadn't taken place. This was the next best thing. Most of the dragon mages had returned to their homes in the village of Lindworm. Some had stayed in the city to help rebuild the once majestic structures they had helped to destroy. With the death of their leader, they had taken the leadership offered by the dragons, and Anwen, as the Kaida, had taken charge of them, albeit reluctantly. Her mother was a leader. She was not.
I still wish Kern hadn't asked me to take charge of the mages.
Anwen sighed as she wrapped her clipping in a silk sleeve.
There are more qualified people, like Courtney.
It didn't matter that Courtney was her age. Still a teenager. She at least had more skill as a mage and experience. That and the mages knew her, whereas she was an outsider. She'd not been in the mountains more than a month and they were already thrusting the responsibility on her. Tyler looked as though he might disagree, but didn't, as something else called for his attention. It was almost as if he heard someone calling his name, but wasn't sure.
I'll be right back,
he assured at her questioning look. He headed off towards the far side of the grove, and the origin of the sound he'd heard only moments before. Anwen watched him in surprise, but didn't follow. Something about his expression told her he didn't want her coming along. It wasn't that she feared danger, but she was still a stranger here. It was best to heed his wishes. Tyler loped towards the section he'd heard the sound coming from. Whatever it was, it seemed to come from the same area where he'd met Kaida Magus before the battle against the mages. Upon reaching the large boulder by which the mage had stood, he stopped. But Kaida Magus wasn't there.
Hello?
Tyler called out as he peered around the trees. The breeze teased his light brown hair.
Anyone out there?
His blue eyes searched the area with no result. The sound of giggling came from a small copse of trees outside the stone circle marking the grove boundary. It was a childlike sound, both young and carefree. Tyler felt sure he'd heard it before. He had his suspicions confirmed when a young child moved out from the trees. She gave a shy little wave, her expression one of mischief. Unlike the last time he'd seen this child, she wore a dark green dress. It made her red hair even more vibrant, her skin to seem that much paler.
Hi.
She said with a wave. Her fingers were as translucent as before, though the rest of her seemed more solid somehow. They'd both been down lower on the island when he'd last seen her. He'd been searching for Anwen after she'd partaken in the Diviner's Sage and awakened her dragon sight. Walking with slow steps, Tyler approached the child. He wasn't sure what this encounter would entail. This little girl, for whatever reason, somehow managed to confuse his dragon senses. It was almost as if she didn't quite exist in this reality, and yet he could see her, hear her when she wanted, and her visage remained the same, that of a 3 to 4 year old child.
Hello.
He greeted, squatting to be at eye level with her.
What are you doing here? Where are your parents?
The child smiled a secretive smile as she put her hands behind her back. She twisted at the waist, back and forth, back and forth. It was the same question he'd asked her the first time they'd met.
They're busy,
She replied.
Mama's talking to Mommy. Wanna play?
Without thinking, Tyler reached out a hand and ruffled her hair. It took a moment to register the odd sensation of not quite touching something.
Perhaps some other time. Is your friend Kaida here?
The little girl looked thoughtful for a moment, but shook her head as she gave him a smile worthy of any sprite.
Nope, but Mama says I can play. You need to ask Mama?
Tyler couldn't help but laugh.
You are persistent.
He observed.
All right, little one. I'll play. What's your name?
Her smile widened as she leaned closer, bringing her mouth even with his ear. As if revealing a great secret, the child leaned in closer.
They call me Emmy.
She whispered. Anwen couldn't help but stare in the direction Tyler had headed. He'd already been gone several minutes, and it didn't look like he'd be returning anytime soon. Should she go after him? No. If he'd wanted her with him, he'd have asked her to come at the onset. With a sigh, she settled down on the ground to wait.
Good morning.
A woman's voice called out from behind her, causing her to jump.
My apologies.
The voice continued as Anwen turned to confront its owner.
I did not mean to startle you.
As Anwen turned, she caught sight of a long white skirt. Looking up, she realized the woman was much taller than her. She had to lean back to see her face. Clear blue eyes met her more hazel ones. Anwen uttered.
Who are you?
She hadn't thought anyone else was on the island. Courtney and Walter should have headed to the mainland by now, which left her and Tyler. They should be alone, but she couldn't deny the presence of this woman. Logic or not, the woman knelt, settling gracefully next to Anwen. Her skirt flared out around her as she sat.
I am the first Kaida,
She replied.
which makes me your many times great-grandmother, Kaida Magus.
Anwen's mouth hung open in shock, her eyes wide.
I'm sorry?
She wasn't sure if she could believe this or not. After all, there was no way her many times great whatever could possibly appear in front of her, Sacred Grove or not. That would mean one of two things. Somehow time no longer made sense, or she was dreaming. Kaida Magus smiled.
I know this may be somewhat confusing for you, but the flow of time has become disrupted. That is why you can see me now. If it were not so, it would be your mother you see instead.
Tears pricked at Anwen's eyes at the mention of her mother.
I don't understand.
A deep ache threatened to overwhelm her, despite her attempts to lock it away.
That ring.
Kaida pointed, indicating the one Margot had worn. Anwen raised her right hand and the ring on her third finger flashed in the light.
That is the mage ring, passed down the direct line of my blood. You are already aware of that ancestral connection. What is not common knowledge, however, is the existence and origin of that gem.
Anwen turned her hand to look at the engraved stone. It looked like any other large emerald to her, despite the dragon form carved into its surface. Even the band was unremarkable, the dull gray of tarnished silver.
What's so special about it?
Kaida's eyes took on a faraway look as she began to chant.
One of mortal, one of stone, one of dragon shall be born, a fair little dragon, keeper of the keys, all to mend, all to set free, ere the darkness come, all to join or all shall die. The past, the present, all must align, or the light be forever gone.
The older woman's gaze pierced Anwen as their eyes locked.
This prophecy was given at the making of that ring. As the hammer fell to lock the stone in place, Koren, first offspring of Nurrim, uttered those words.
It seemed as if the sound of drums filled the air, beating out a steady cadence. All around, fire appeared to leap up as the sacred grove faded from sight. Anwen found herself in the heart of the mountain, where the great crystal pulsed like a beating heart. A small group of dragons stood around the same forge they had once used to make the master key of Tarragon. Kern stood in dragon form, with another dragon of pure silver next to his side. As the smiths hammered away, the silver dragon, Koren, became rigid. Words poured from her mouth in the ancient tongue. Watching, it seemed as though her eyes had rolled back into their sockets.
Ai Gidanolan, Ai Girinak, Ai Gidrukal Tanadat Anat, Ai Anada Kaida, Belianat, G Katso Beldash, Ka Momal, Ka Shilelo, Ka Molal Danjial, Katskanak, Katshantat, Ka Mola Moda Shile Loda Tsulome, Da Shile Putrakats, Enthinat.
The words echoed through the chamber as if spoken by a god. The ground shook with the last hammer stroke. As the final word came from Koren's mouth, she crumpled to the ground. Her scales began to dull and fall to the ground with the sound of cascading rain. At the same moment, blue-white flames seemed to engulf her, leaving only the scales behind. Anwen blinked and was back in the grove, Kaida staring at her with half-glazed eyes.
She died.
The girl whispered in realization. What must it have felt like to lose your first child, she wondered. It wouldn't surprise her if the pain was as great, if not more so, than what she tried to bury inside at the loss of her mother. Kaida looked to the ground.
Yes, she died. There are some who believe her life force became one with that stone. When Kern met my mother, he gave her that ring, and it has been passed down the line since that time. To you.
Holding the ring aloft once more, Anwen couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The stone seemed to pulse as she gazed at it.
Every Kaida?
The woman nodded.
To every true Kaida. Many have tried to lay claim to that title, as you are well aware. But you are more. So much more. Only a direct descendant of the Master Keepers can use that key.
She pointed to the miniature dragon hanging from a chain around Anwen's neck.
Unless you are a dragon, or one charged to become the Master Keeper when another cannot fulfill that duty.
Anwen picked at the grasses beside her, trying to take it all in.
But that prophecy,
She hesitated.
what does it have to do with me?
Kaida smiled.
You already know, at least in part. The previous prophecies you have heard play into it. The rest you will understand when the time is right.
She began to fade as she spoke. By the time she had uttered her last word, she faded from sight.
Wait!
Anwen called out, reaching out a hand as if to stop her, but got no reply. Kaida Magus was gone.